getting this
friends.
cat. Everyone needs to see this cat.
This is this is Lilo, I think.
You think?
She's very he I don't know if it's a he or a she.
Oh,
Um,
dude.
sh- very sweet,
Oh my
and she
God.
just pops on you. The other one is over there, and it's I trust it less. Um,
Hello and welcome to It's Hardback Out Here in Conversation with. Today I am absolutely thrilled to be welcoming Sean Hewitt into our lovely little community. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Sean.
yeah, hello. It's lovely to be here. I guess I'm a writer. I live in Dublin. I teach here at Trinity College. I've written two collections of poetry, the latest of which was out in January this year, called Rapture's Road. But I think we're here to talk about the memoir, which came out in 2022. It's called All Down Darkness Light. I can see it on your bookcase
Yes, I
there.
also have Rapture's Road. I'm doing some shameless promo for you here. So,
Oh,
yeah, I'm going to ask for commission after the interview's done. Um, yeah,
so well.
um, I wanted to talk about that actually. You started your writing career as a poet and an academic mainly, and I think
Yeah.
you explore a lot of similar themes in your writing. I wanted to know what it was about the stories in All Down Darkness Wide that made you say this needs to be in a different format. This needs to be a longer piece.
Yeah. Well, as you say, like a lot of the first part of my first collection, Tongues of Fire, uh, charts some of the story of All Down Darkness White. So there's some kind of crossover there. But the difference for me was that in poetry you can kind of be quite elusive. Um, and I've had people read those poems as things other than what I thought they were about. And so the subject matter is a little bit looser with a poem because you kind of just stop and leave you somewhere and you don't have to tell the whole story. But I started off writing what I thought was going to be like a gothic novel. Um, and that was partly because I didn't really have a job and I kind of wanted something to do, and it was in some ways there's something quite hopeful about doing a long project because you feel that you've given yourself some purpose. So it started off like that. But I also found as I went, not only that it would be a memoir and that it would be nonfiction, but that everything was a bit too big and complicated for me to get into the poems. The poems weren't quite hitting some of the things I wanted to get at. I think for me, poems are primarily um like emotionally charged. And what I wanted to do in the book was think a bit more. And prose seems much more useful for thinking and kind of linking big pieces of stories together than poetry does.
Yeah, definitely. I think that definitely comes across in the book. I mean, there are so many aspects of it where I've just gone, that is very similar to my own experiences, to friends that
Mhm.
I've spoken to, and I wanted to get your perspective on that as you were writing it. It's a very internal exploration almost, but did you have any idea that you might have had, say, a random queer boy from Wolverhampton reading it and going, this is hitting so many marks for me? Was that something
Yeah,
you
not
processed?
really. I mean, it was quite that kind of came after I'd written the book because I started getting like lovely emails and letters and stuff from people. And what was really surprising for me was when I was writing the book, I thought really I was in my own head, obviously, because I was writing a book about me. But the paranoia of writing the book was maybe this is just me. And maybe um I'm kind of indulging myself in writing this whole book about my life and what use is that to anybody else. But I was listening to the poet Denise Riley. I don't know if you know Denise Riley's work. And she was saying that, you know, the kind of wager you have to make with yourself is that the more personal the thing is, if you get it down right, the more likely it is to be universal because it will have some sort of human element to it, and that will be the thing that makes it connect with other people. So that is the one thing that kind of keeps you going as you're writing very personal stuff, is the idea that maybe we are kind of all connected, and what happens to me in a very isolated way might also chime with other people. And you know, it wasn't just, obviously the book had a big queer readership, but it also had, you know, readers who were, you know, like 60-year-old straight women who had kind of come to me and said, you know, I felt like this at one point, or that this is kind of made me think more about how I perform myself and am not necessarily living in a way that accords with what I think I am in my head and all this sort of stuff. Um, so I suppose that they have like little prisms books, and everyone gets into them in different ways. Um, but no, it was very refreshing and actually quite um liberating to hear that after the book came out, because writing it threw me into a lot of anxiety and isolation, which I didn't enjoy. So it was quite a relief. Yeah.
That isolation as you're writing, it must be a very difficult thing while revisiting some quite difficult moments and aspects that I think a lot of people would struggle with. And as I say, I personally connected a lot to the book, and especially your the experiences that you had not long after coming out. There's a passage where you're talking about the one of your first boyfriends after you came out, and the idea of him being a little bit too feminine or too overtly out, I guess, in a way. I'm from a very working class background, and I had a lot of the same hang-ups when I was first exploring my sexuality and figuring out who I was.
Yeah.
And I had the barriers of entry of like, I don't relate exactly to what that is. Why don't I relate exactly to what that is? And
Yeah.
how do I place myself in these two worlds almost? And that
Mm.
leads me on to the next question of, there's those sort of two identities of queerness and straightness. It can be quite isolating to sit somewhere in the middle because you're not quite one, you're not quite the other.
Mm.
Do you think that assimilating more into what is like a heteronormative world that we live in, do you think that that helps us find our place and connection more? Or do you think that it ends up isolating us from the people that really know us?
But I think it probably isolates you. And you know, when I was writing the book, particularly that passage, which you just kind of reminded me of here, there were a couple of things that I was almost afraid of putting in the book, because I thought, well, that doesn't make me look like a very nice person. But you have to kind of forget about being liked
Mm-hmm.
you know, the narrator of the book is not there to reflect well on you. Um, and and I think actually people respond to the honesty more so because, you know, everyone is not a nice person at some point. Um, but I think what I was getting at there is the way that through trying to assimilate, through trying not to draw attention to yourself, you actually pull in all of the weaponry of a heterosexual world and deliver it out again. So you actually become a sort of vessel of all of those prejudices, and you use them to protect yourself. You know, you assimilate so far that you can point elsewhere and say, at least I'm not that person, or at least I don't behave like this person. And I think that in trying to find a sort of peace for yourself by assimilating, which I think is where it comes from. You know, you want to just live an easier life. You end up making your life much worse because you start to cluster in all of those prejudices and they inhabit you and you become that sort of person. Um, and it's a very difficult thing to try and figure out. Um, you know, when I was writing the book, and that passage that you quoted actually comes, I think, like further towards the end of the book. I go in like not a chronological order at all. But I did have some ideas as to why that was, and a lot of memoirs go kind of start to finish chronologically. And they're often like an overcoming, and they have like this very linear forward, things get bad and then they get better and better and better. Um, and I thought that, you know, for a queer memoir, it's often a case of trying to undo and go backwards. Um, because maybe the thing that you're trying to get towards, the thing at the end of a linear thing, is actually in the past. You know, it's who you were before you took on all of these prejudices and ideas. Um, so trying to kind of undo that assimilation by moving back rather than moving forward was what I was hoping to do. Um, in a way of trying to undo damage. Um, and I think the book probably ends not in a place of you know, job done. I'm sorted. But you know, maybe I've unpicked enough of the damage to start in a different way, remaking a different self. So I kind of wanted it to move towards a sort of liberation and recreation at the end. But yeah.
It's a really interesting way to think about writing a memoir, this sort of looking back to find the answer forward. Would you also think that the way that you interact with art and poetry is in a similar sort of way? I mean, the work you talk about, Boyd and Hopkins and their work a lot in this memoir. Is it through
Mm.
looking at these works of the past that really gave you a new framework to think about yourself and your place in the world?
Yeah, I suppose it must be. You know, it's one of those questions that I kind of struggle to answer.
Mhm.
And, no matter how much I examine why I like reading or why I like to write, I never get to the bottom of like what the proper um fundamental driver is. Like I've spent like 15 years trying to come up with a sort of answer to that question, but I don't think I can. Um, and I think in some ways it's just a sort of extension of your own mind. In a book, when you read a book, you know, like you're not just you,
Mhm.
you're also kind of bringing on other people's ideas, and it's a way of kind of, even if momentarily, living outside of yourself in another person's head. And what would that be like? And does that change the way that you see things, or does that kind of ignite something that makes you feel like you weren't isolated in having that thought or idea? And that can be quite energizing. So maybe that is kind of behind it, but I don't think I have that kind of rigorous um, method in finding books that serve a particular purpose for me. You know, like I don't have like a program of books that I think I'm going to learn X from. Usually it's just kind of randomly chasing enjoyment through things, and that enjoyment comes in different forms at different times. But yeah, with All Down Darkness Wide, it was um two poets who I love, and who during those moments in my life became very important to me for how they kind of scaffolded the way I could think through certain ideas or become examples. And it was just kind of a convergence of biographies as well. You know, those two poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins and Corinne Boyer. Um, the latter of which I don't think most people will be familiar with because she doesn't really have an English translation, is a Swedish modernist poet. Um, but the two biographies kind of became uncannily similar to aspects of the life I was describing in the memoir. So they kind of became like echoes or mirrors. I kind of use them as ghosts as a way on the way through. But um, yeah, I think as well, that ability to articulate something that you are trying to get to the heart of when you're writing or just when you're living and thinking, um, is something I turn to those poets for in the book. If only to kind of reassure myself or reassure the story that it wasn't an isolated story, that it was this kind of bigger historical thing. Which was part of what I wanted to do in the book was to put one life in the context of history rather than just have it be a kind of memoir in the way that like a celebrity might write a memoir or something. Yeah.
Yeah, like a Katie Price memoir is probably not going to have
Yeah.
this cultural context. So,
No, they have different purposes.
yes, very much so, very much so. I think you opening their spectrum more to sort of that those multiple experiences all coming together. I think it speaks very much to my experience of reading the book as well. As I said, I write little like mini first thoughts every time I finish a book, and one of the things that I wrote down was I feel a little bit less alone now, which I think is a
That's
really so thank you for writing it first of all. But I think this book came to me at a time after I'd just come out of quite a bad breakup, and I was feeling very to
mm,
myself. I felt like my experiences are this isolated thing, and I don't understand where I am in the world anymore. So the theme that runs throughout your book of this sort of blood being a connection between people and their experiences, and the passage near, I think it's near the beginning of the book in the graveyard, where there's that similar sense of, there is something connecting all of these people. There is a line that carries through everyone. I found that such
yeah.
an interesting idea, and I don't know if there's any other bits that maybe I might have missed that you might want to add about that.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm really glad that the book made you feel heard. Um, I really like the idea that a book can be that is not just me talking,
Mhm.
you know, um, because I think often it's like that two-way street that is almost impossible to get in an outside of an art form
Mm,
where you might feel heard by something or by someone who isn't in the room.
mm,
And likewise, I might be chatting in a room somewhere where I don't even know where I am. I think that's kind of a weird thing. Um, I think, what I was getting to was it began with this idea actually of um, inheritance because I was looking at kind of historic, I had the Victorians and Swedish modernists in the back of my head, and then in that beginning in the graveyard, I had the generation of the 80s and 90s and HIV/AIDS and all of that, um, and thinking about um, ancestry or inheritance, and how outside of a kind of blood lineage, you know, of people's parents or whatever. I think it's one of those identity categories, queerness, um, that doesn't that isn't inherited in a clear way. So you don't have this kind of immediate family role model of what that is, which I think leads to, particularly during adolescence, like a sense of isolation from everyone. Um, but as you come out and then live your life, you realize that what you were doing or what you were going through was kind of uncannily similar to what loads of other people go through, which is weird because there's a sort of isolation that you experience. But then we realize that all of our isolations were actually very similar and we kind of bond over those experiences. Um, so I was kind of trying to get to the heart of what is it that um, you said growing up in Wolverhampton was similar to me. We may have both felt quite alone, but ended up making similar choices or having similar experiences. What is it that connects those two things. Um, and my only answer was, well, it is the way that you're treated and framed
Mhm.
as an adolescent that produces these kind of experiences. So it's kind of that uncanny, unseen hand of culture and politics and pressure that's forcing your life into a certain direction that you believe to be just yourself. You don't believe yourself to be influenced by 20 years ago men that you never met. But somehow the way that those people with HIV/AIDS were treated led into the way that your parents thought about queerness, and then they passed that down to you, and then you act in this way, and it's all a kind of political inheritance. And I was kind of puzzling at the idea of what would it mean to be almost less in control of your life in some ways than you thought you were, and moved to do certain things that you thought were conscious decisions, but maybe had an unconscious hand in them. And what might it mean to actually look at, analyze, and think past those forces in your own life? I probably waffled a bit there, but I think I was thinking about all of these like webs of inheritance and pressure and coercion that are unseen outside of the traditional ways we might think of um, family inheritance or bloodlines and things like that.
That web of connections, another very interesting point. These like shared experiences and almost shared behaviors. There's the sections where you're talking about you seeing sort of the underbelly of your hometown once you realize about like the cruising spots and loitering in bathrooms and all of that sort of fun stuff. And also then I think nowadays it's become much more easy to find those sorts of experiences and um, find other like-minded people, I guess. Um, my question coming from that is that do you think that that creates more connection between queer people nowadays, or do you think that it might also be a slightly isolating factor? I feel like now with things like Grinder, it can be a massive thing of looking at yourself and saying, who am I in relation to who desires me? So is that impacting my worth, and what does that mean in my standing in society? And well, I mean, that's my depressing
Yeah.
experiences of it. But yeah, I just wanted to get if that's the same, if you think that it might still be the same sort of way nowadays.
Well, so I don't know how old you are. I don't want to look like I'm really old as I'm not that old. But I was lucky enough to, I've grown up when there wasn't social media. I can't remember really, but I think like MySpace or something came out when I was like 16, or at least that's when I got it, 16,
Mm-hmm.
17. So I had most of my childhood and youth without any sort of visibility online. Like I never had a sense of being scrutinized by anyone apart from the people that I could see in
Mm-hmm.
front of me. Um, and I don't know how it is to grow up without that. I imagine that it must be very difficult. I wouldn't like it. I don't like it now, and I'm an adult who can process things a little bit more clearly than a teenager. Um, I I think that things weren't good in the noughties for loads of other ways. The newspapers in particular and the like the TV media was toxic and horrible. And that filters through. There was no sense of not being exposed to um, culture just because you didn't have the internet. It was in the newspapers, it was on the TV, it was on the radio, everyone talked about it. So that didn't change. And in fact, in the noughties and I guess like the late 90s, I definitely had a sense of wrongness from the media, in terms of sexuality, like queer sexuality.
Mhm.
Um, I think what was different was that um, you didn't have access to anyone else. So, when I came out, I was the only person in a school of like 2,000 people who had come out. Um, so I I kind of had to figure it out on my own, and figuring it out on your own means making a lot of bad mistakes and taking a lot of kind of um, probably unwise decisions. And I didn't really have anyone to have advice from. I was in Warrington, so um, there wasn't like a bar that you could go to. I couldn't like slip off to Canal Street or something if I was in Manchester. Um, so that was quite isolating. But I imagine that would be quite similar for most people today. I think just because you can get on Grindr doesn't mean people are going to be nice to you and give you loads of advice that whatever, people are dicks. um, but I think that an awareness of how um, severely you might be judged by people is certainly something that comes along with the internet and with social media and apps and things like that, that wasn't, at least I don't remember, quite such a prevalent force when I was growing up. Even now, kind of social media stresses me out periodically, and I turn it off and I delete it for a couple of months until someone at my publisher says, "Are you going back on Twitter soon?" So yeah, I think these things don't help build community. Um, but then I didn't have a community to start off with, so I don't know if it's really entirely that much worse.
Mhm.
I think that we have to, focus on other means of finding information and good information and finding people. I think, like you can't really bypass the importance of just human connection, being in a bar together or being in a youth group together or whatever.
Mhm.
It's so much better being online together, um, which never seems to go particularly well in my experience. But
Yeah, I think it's one of those sort of double-edged swords nowadays because you can more easily find other queer people to at least say, "Oh, I'm not the only gay in the village." But
yeah,
like you say, you also get you all your experiences are still your own, and the person that you are is still going to be slightly different to every other person, which sometimes isn't immediately welcomed into certain spaces and certain groups and even certain subcultures of larger groups.
yeah. I mean, we were talking before about assimilation and throwing out prejudices.
Mhm.
I think if you logged onto Grindr, you would see a very clear example of what we're talking about there, the ways in which people um, create their own kind of regulated environments of prejudice and the anonymity or the distance from people elevates the
Mhm.
way that happens. So I don't think those are healthy things.
Mhm.
But sometimes they're kind of necessary or fun or whatever. Um, and I think you get the same if you go into a gay bar. You get people in groups that look you up and down, like, what are you doing here?
Mhm.
You know.
Yeah, the new trend of demon twinks is really just it's taking over
I'm
TikTok.
not familiar, thankfully, but
Never heard of them.
what
um,
is that?
it's the stereotype of the sort of the very young white man in their group of four or five. They're essentially the mean girls in the corner. They're looking for the one straight passing man and being quite horrible to every other person that they see. So
Yeah, that's familiar.
some things never change.
No.
You're talking about prejudice in there. I think the the talk of religion in the book is it's a very similar kind of story with that. I wanted to hear a bit more about your experience with religion. I know in the book you sort of denounce it, but then even by the end of the book, there's an element of, maybe there is another way of looking at spirituality. And I think that might be something I'd like to hear a bit more about personally.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is another question that I haven't quite got to the bottom of myself. Um, and I mean, I guess I always feel the need to preface this question with the idea that I don't believe in God.
Mm.
Uh, which I feel like I need to preface it because I write about it a lot. Um, and I was trying to get to the heart of why do I keep on coming back to the idea of it if I don't believe in it? Um, and I think in some ways it's very attractive thought experiment to me. I like the possibilities of religious thinking,
Mhm.
even if I don't necessarily believe in them. In the same way that I like Jane Eyre, but I don't have to believe that it was real.
Mhm.
I kind of feel the same way about churches and places of worship and things. I grew up, another thing, I grew up in, uh, even to say a Catholic family would be a little bit untrue. My dad didn't really have any religion, and my mum is Catholic, but like her family is more Catholic than she is, and I don't think now I can't really speak on her behalf, but I don't think she feels particularly invested in Catholicism. Um, so it was quite strange as I grew up. I kind of invested myself in Catholicism, um, and I think it was a way of trying to blanket myself in something that was sold to me as morally good, or you will be a good person if you do all of this well. And aren't you, uh, when you're in church and you're young, you're in a minority. So, um, so to be like the good young person, the upstanding one, to have everyone's approval, like obviously that's an attractive proposition, especially if you feel like a bad person or wrong in a way when you're younger. So I really lent into it. Um, not, I don't think that I ever really fully believed in it. Um, but I liked to put myself on the side, on the religious side of things because I think that it set me apart in a moral way. Um, and then all of that came crumbling down, like it happens to do, when I grew up, and there was kind of um, the passing of the um, law for equal marriage rights, brought out all of the weird creatures in British politics and the church, and I became kind of radicalized the other way against it. I was like, burn it all down. And now I've kind of mellowed into a middle ground. But I think for me, religion is something I keep on coming back to because I find it an attractive and kind of beautiful set of ideas. And even if it's fictional, that doesn't really bother me. If I was in the realm of hard fact, I wouldn't be a writer. So I kind of get a bit frustrated when people, try to say that religion is useless because it's not true. Um, that seems to me as stupid a thing to say as, um, literature is useless because it's fictional. And um, I enjoy the music. I enjoy the the language of it. I enjoy the kind of what ifs of religion. And I find them in some way more engaging than the what ifs of science, even though, I know that science is true. But I'm not particularly
The Earth isn't flat. Is that what you're telling
no, like, like I I think that I can live in the real world and know that, like, this is real.
Yeah.
Um, but that is not where I find the enjoyment of life most of the time. It's in the imaginative world.
Mhm.
Um, so religion is a nice imaginative world sometimes.
I just wanted to touch a little bit on the. So I know I've said it a few times, so I've really connected to this piece, especially just the journey that your relationship went on with both Jack and Elias. I think it was very moving for me personally. I've got what me and my friends call crunchy brains, where we, so it's not always the brain chemistry doesn't always do what it's supposed to do, and it was one of those moments where reading from the periphery of some things is sometimes more eye-opening than listening to somebody's experience while they're in it. Um,
Mm.
was it was it a difficult experience for you, and did you find it quite clinical, I guess, in a way, to look back and be like, what needs to be said, and how can I explore
Mm.
this?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest kind of, I'm kind of glad that you say that and other people have said it too, because the biggest fear that I had when writing the book was a fear of, I kept on having to kind of justify to myself that I had a right to my own life, um, and a right to my own story.
Mhm.
Because I think what happened in my head was that I had begun to see most of my kind of 20s up to about 27 or something as me being a bystander in someone else's story. They were kind of the spotlight because they had to kind of demand the spotlight because everything was going so spectacularly bad for them, that wasn't my turn for the spotlight, and I got that. But when it came back to writing it, I had to kind of figure out, like, how do you write a story of which you're not kind of the main player, the kind of dramatic player. Instead, you're the person that was in the caring role, in the often kind of passive side, standing, panicking, thinking role. And what are kind of the ethics and implications of having to tell that side of the story? But the thing that meant that I needed to write it was that, um, I couldn't find another book like that to read, and I've been looking for one for ages. I read loads of accounts, first person accounts of people going through difficult times with their mental health, but I couldn't find the family's account, or the partner's account, or the best friend's account. Um, and I needed that because I think that, like, for every person that suffers depression, there is that other side. There is someone else next to it. It's not kind of an isolated occurrence.
Mhm.
Same with any disease and illness, that it's always a bigger impact than just on the one person. Um, so when I was going back through, I was having to kind of excavate, where is my part and where is someone else's part, and how do I actually account for having lived for such a long time feeling like there was no part for me. And so when it came back to writing it, I went through kind of ups and downs of either feeling very defiant, like, no, this is my life, and then being very self-doubting and anxious that it wasn't my life. But then I kind of got to the point of, well, if that wasn't my life, then what was my life? That was the only life I lived. So it kind of, I had to get to a point of, I mean, I had to kind of research myself to write this book, by which I mean that I think there were moments in which, um, I don't think I was well, at the time, although I was um, functional, um, because I forgot so much stuff, and loads of it is like a gap in time. I couldn't pick out the order of events very well. Um, People would say things that happened that I had basically no recollection of happened. I would talk to my mom or something, and she would say, well, we went to this place and you said this, and I had no recollection of ever doing it. So, I mean, this was where social media came in quite useful. I went back into, like my Facebook Messenger messages that I'd sent to people during the time, because I could track then what I'd been doing and where I was. Likewise, my emails. Um, I use Google Maps a lot um, because I had to rejig where, um, like even practically, how did I get from A to B? Um, and so that was quite weird. In terms of the experience of writing it, it wasn't fun. Um, and I suppose what happens, and it probably happens to anyone that writes a memoir, is that you have to kind of inhabit it again, in order to get it all down on the page. And then inhabiting it again is not what your body or your mind really wants to do. There's a reason why you kind of can't remember it and you compartmentalize it, is because you don't want to dredge it up again. I wouldn't really describe it as clinical. Um, I would probably describe it as a sort of um, emotional opening of Pandora's box. Then you just have to figure out a way of getting everything back inside the box again once you opened it. Um, so um, there were moments where I just kind of put it down for a while. There were moments where I really just was a very anxious and not very happy person when I was writing it. So I probably caused suffering to those around me while I was writing the book. But thankfully, I had very patient people around me that put up with it. But I won't be doing it again in a hurry.
I think you should be very, very proud of what you've put out, if you aren't already, which I'm sure you are.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm happy with how it's done. Yeah.
my last question to you is, of course, we are a community for 20 somethings, and this month, the month of filming, we're talking a lot about loneliness and how to combat that. So my last question is, what advice would you give to your 20 something year old self to sort of help deal with any of those feelings, or how to process them?
I think something that would have helped me in my 20s would be to know in the most reassuring way possible that your 20s are not always that fun, because they kind of entail having to figure out everything. And for the most part, you're not being paid very much. You don't have kind of a solid trajectory that you've figured out for yourself. And the people around you that do have a solid trajectory will have quit that job and had an implosion by the age of 30, which happened to literally everyone I knew that was on, a grad scheme lawyer all the way to 30, and then they, couldn't handle it and quit, and now they do something else. So there isn't like just one path through. And I think that once you kind of commit a little bit to that idea of anarchy in your 20s, that takes a lot of pressure off, because you put yourself under so much pressure that you should be doing XYZ and comparing yourself across to other people who are, getting married or buying a house or whatever. Um, and so I maybe that helps. Just kind of committing to the fact that things are bad. And I do feel, bad for 20-year-olds now, in a similar way to when I was 20 odd, that, I came out of university during the recession. So there were no jobs, there was student protests, there was like austerity and horror everywhere. And it just wasn't a particularly positive world to come out into. And I think it's probably the same for 20-year-olds now. Um, but it does kind of one way or another all begin to slot into place. And I think it's just that you need 5 or 6 years of turmoil and a lack of direction in order for that to happen. In terms of loneliness, it's quite a difficult one. I think I tend to be relatively happy in my own company, shall we say. So loneliness has got me a couple of times, particularly when I moved to Ireland for like the first year or so, because I had like no one. And I'm also not particularly good at making new friends. So um, I would say, God, I don't know. I mean, like reading groups like this are great. I recently started, there's one in Dublin called, I think it's just called Queer Book Club.
But giving them free promo on our channel.
No, it's a great place to go, and there's people there that you can all chat to, and I think books are a really good way of making conversation because you have kind of middleman, which is the book, to talk through. And it takes the pressure off just having to figure out something to say if you're not a particularly good person at figuring out how to say things. And also don't go too hard on like dating, because I think dating is actually a very isolating experience. At least for me, it was. I found myself kind of questioning myself a lot, and being thrown into like spirals by someone that I'd literally spoken to for a week and then ghosted me. And I would allow that to really hit my mental health and self-worth, which is an insane thing to
We've
even
all been
say.
there. We're all still in the trenches, some of us. So
So, I would say, like, you'll be fine without dating for a little bit if because friends will stay. Like, dates are almost by definition very anxiety producing. So give yourself a break from them if you don't need them.
heard it here first, folk.
Dating.
Chaos, men are trash. Don't do it. Great.
Yeah.
Sean, I just want to thank you so much for coming and having a chat with me. If you couldn't tell, I've just been gushing about this book, and I'm a massive fan of yours, so it's meant the world to me for you to be here. Is there anything that you would like to plug to anybody watching or listening?
Well, I have a novel coming out next year. So if you enjoyed this book, and if you didn't, read my novel, which is I had the intention of it being a happier, more summery, romantic sort of book, although the sadness creeps in despite myself. So yeah, summertime sadness, coming 2025 from me.
Amazing. And also make sure to pick up Raptures Road if you haven't already, everyone. Thank you again, Sean, so much.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.